Good afternoon, everyone. I'm simply delighted not only to see so many people, but the diversity. I mean, here we have truly the university, right? I mean, students, faculty, staff, administrators, it's just a delight. So thank you all for coming, and thank you, John, for your introduction. Where else would you get McGinty and O'Connor? Who says it's not an Irish church? But something that John said evoked a memory of many years ago when Father Mike Walsh was president of Boston College. And he was moving very strongly to make the transformation from Boston College, from a small streetcar college to a major Catholic university. And he felt we should be a university here at Boston College, and his reason, among others, was that a Catholic university is where the church does its thinking, and where the church should do its thinking. And so there is a flavor of that, I think, in what certainly the program of the church in the 21st century is about, and indeed what we are about here today. I'm very, very honored that in many ways John was centering this exhibit about this book. Is that right, John? Hold up the book? Is that what you said? Yeah. Because I do need the shoes. Which is called 2 Centuries of Faith. And as the title implies, this is an observation by Boston College and the talents of Boston College to do something to commemorate the 200 years of the Archdiocese of Boston. A very, very important commemoration, and one that should not be ignored. But Father Leahy wanted to make the observation within what we do as a university, and that is to think and to research and to write. And so out of this came this collection of scholarly essays. And the question is, yes, the Catholic Church was established in Boston in 1808, at a time where, for all practical purposes, there was no church. I mean, if you want to see a fantastic story, that story begins with this book, with the decision that there be 4 new bishoprics in the United States. Baltimore was already there, and there would be one in Philadelphia, another one in New York, there would be one in Kentucky, there would be one in Boston. But most people at the time said, it's impossible. You Boston, the most Puritan town, the most anti-Catholic town in this new American republic. For one thing, we say, what's so surprising about that? There weren't any priests there. I mean, after all, through the whole colonial period, papists, what they called the priests, but Roman Catholic priests were not allowed in the Bay Colony, under penalty of jail, first of all, if they were caught, and if they came back, of execution. And the general attitude was, that was the answer, you see. If there were no priests, no Catholics would come, right? And for all practical purposes, it worked, except for a handful of French and Irish Catholics. Again, there was, in a sense, nothing of the formal church here in Boston until the resident priests began to arrive from France. And the first bishop, Bishop Chevreuse, was appointed by then Archbishop Carroll, and the church began. But think of it now, a Roman Catholic bishop in Boston, and not only that, a Frenchman. It'll never work. And yet it did. And it's a fascinating story, and you should read it. And the story was written, by the way, by the French consul in Boston, and by the name of Francois Gautier, who found out what we were doing, got in touch with me and said, I must write it. I didn't know who he was. But I said, well, I'll check with my advisory committee. I didn't have one, but at any rate, I hadn't written about Boston politics for nothing, you know. And found out he was, as a matter of fact, very, very well-versed in French history and the knowledge of the church. And he has written a delightful introduction, but a fascinating introduction, of how the church was rooted here in Boston. How well? When Chevreuse was finally called back to France in 1825 to become an archbishop and subsequently a cardinal, some 200 prominent Boston Protestants wrote a letter pleading with the church not to take him away. Now, how is that possible? Well, you have to read it. But with that, the church has started. 200 years later, we have an anniversary. And to a certain extent, you can ask the practical question, so what? I mean, it's been here 200 years. Has it done anything? Is it of consequence? Is there anything unusual about it? And these are the questions we ask our scholars to look into. What happened in those 200 years with the Catholic Church, starting out almost as a criminal church? But in that course of 200 years, what happened? And so each one of them found some area of interest. And each one of them, as I say, is a scholarly piece in its own, and I think altogether provide us with a very, very fascinating update of the Roman Catholic Church in the greater Boston area. What would be of interest during that period of time? Well, for example, I took the political status of the church, because at the beginning it didn't have any. Irish Catholics didn't have any. With all the talk of Irish cops and Irish firemen, there were absolutely none on those forces until well after the Civil War. And yet, how did they manage? How did the church manage in the face of what was really a hostile political environment to grow, to expand, to acquire respect, to acquire influence in the city and in this greater Boston area? That again is a story. Very, very difficult during the 19th century. But by the 20th century, the church did have power because of its growing population and its growing influence in the greater Boston area. What else was going on at the same time? Because many of these things we were born into. We took them for granted. We saw them developing. We knew they were there, and yet we have a very, very vague idea of the background. The establishment, for example, of Catholic charities. Very, very unique, important development that was written about by Father Brian Hare, probably one of the great national influences on Catholic charity, both from Washington and Boston and Cambridge. He's done a marvelous piece about the slow, gradual development of a Christian sense of charity for people who almost literally at the beginning had nothing, and how that system actually grew into a system, because it was not systematized at the beginning. and by the 20th century was a well-recognized, highly organized, very professional operation of Catholic charities that began working with state associations, federal associations, and became a very, very national influence. What else do you identify? For example, parochial schools. And the parochial school system, which is written about here in the greater Boston area by Father Joseph O'Keefe, who was the dean of our School of Education here at Boston College, and traces the history and the significance of parochial education, of Catholic education, and what it meant at the beginning among immigrant children, and what it meant later when the immigrant influences, for example, became more diverse, of not simply having Irish children, but children of all kinds of ethnic backgrounds and cultures, for example. What was unique about the parochial system? Was it just the public system with some religion thrown in? Or was it distinctive? Was it unique? Were there aspects of it that were uniquely Roman Catholic, for example, or distinctly related to the kind of religious ethos that they felt it should have? And all of this is traced by Father O'Keefe in his studies. What about Catholic culture? Were there any literary figures that were produced in the course of the 200 years of the Church? One of our PhD students, Libby MacDonald, has done a very, very excellent piece on Catholic literary figures, particularly in the late 19th century. Men and women producing works with a Catholic flavor, but trying to deal with this question, which even today in magazines and newspapers and journals, for example, raises the question: are you a Catholic writer, or are you a writer who happens to be Catholic? And what dimension of your religious ideas shape and form the kind of literature that you're producing? And so if you're interested in something like that, there's a marvelous piece in here which points out what the heyday of this was here in the greater Boston area, and why it seemed to fail as the 20th century went on. And of course, go to the 900-pound elephant in the room, the question of diversity. The changing nature, for example, of the Catholic population. A wonderful piece done by William MacDonald, Bill MacDonald, who teaches down at Emmanuel College, and one of our PhDs, who deals with persons of color here in the Archdiocese, for example, many of whom were members of the Church back at the time of Bishop Chevreuse, and others who came during the early part of the 19th century, but focusing particularly on what we might call the New Catholics, who've come in particularly since the 1960s. Earlier than that, African Americans after World War II, most of whom were not Catholic, but many of whom who were, and were seeking to know, well, what was their position here in Boston? What was their relationship to, and again, what was generally assumed to be the Catholic Church? After all, look at the cultural makeup, the demographic makeup of the Church at that time, before these new people came in. I mean, all the bishops were Irish, all the priests were Irish, all the communicants were Irish, and into this church come different people. and then increasingly more and more different. Again, as we moved into the 1960s, people from Latin America, South America, people from Asia, Vietnam, all moving into a church that didn't know quite what to make of them, certainly how to deal with them. It's fascinating. And John McGinty mentioned that one of the things that they are focusing on now, and a topic that another writer took up, was the role of women in the church, done by a longtime teacher here at Boston College, Carol Hurd Green. He's a marvelous teacher and even a better writer. Her opening paragraphs alone are worth the 20% discount. They're marvelous. She has a kaleidoscopic description of women in the church here in the Archdiocese of Boston that's just wonderful. And out of that kaleidoscope pulls the threads one by one as she traces slow, gradual upward development of women in the church here in the greater Boston area, starting with a small number of nuns, and then a larger group of orders of nuns moving in, but then gradually, particularly in the 20th century, expanding to show the really important and expanding role of women in the church as time went on. As a matter of fact, she has so much information there, it's really, to me, it was mind-boggling. I mean, you've got to read it. And of course, one of the things as we spoke about, well, what do you think people would be interested in? The question came up, well, what about parish life? What do you think? In 200 years, do you think parish life is different now than it was then? And my reaction was, well, let's go ask a pastor. So I have a friend of mine named Bill Schmidt, William Schmidt, and he's the pastor of St. Patrick's in Stoneham. And he loves history as well as he loves the church. And he's very, very good at it, so I asked him, Bill, would you do this? And he did it. And it's really a marvelous story. Now, here we're working at history at the ground level. History from the ground up. See? And he began, again, 200 years ago with what parish life was like. It was very interesting. It was primarily made up of lay people. As I mentioned earlier, there weren't any priests. And so for a while, the lay people ran everything. As a matter of fact, since they were kind of new to the scene, they looked around and said, well, I don't know, how do you run a church? Right? And the only other church in Massachusetts at that time was the Congregational Church. And so the early church was actually set up on the congregational model. You know, they had church wardens, they had financial advisors, they ran their own church for a long period of time. And then gradually things began to change. And then things continued to change and so forth over the course of 200 years. And then I don't know about you, but as I came to the final paragraphs of the article, I felt we were going back to the future. I mean, all of a sudden I'm saying, hey, wait a minute, as he's describing what's happening in his parish now, and some of the parishes around him, for example, it was a kind of uncanny feeling that we were turning the clock back again, back at the beginning. And in all of this, and over all of this, of course, was the question of church leadership. And my good friend and colleague James O'Toole has done a scholarly article on church leadership, Episcopal leadership. Very, very, very interesting. Among other things, indicating that here's a situation where policies and decisions made by an Episcopal leader, let's say in the Archdiocese of Boston, is something that would go on for 20 years or 40 years. I mean, there are no 4-year terms here, like the presidents. In 200 years, there are only 8 bishops. Cardinal O'Malley is now the 9th. But there were 4 bishops in the 19th century, and there were 4 bishops in the 20th century. And any one of those would have a reign of from 20 to 40 years. Archbishop Williams, for example, was 40 years. Cardinal O'Connell was almost 40 years. So decisions and policies are not easily overturned, when these ideas become established. Well, at any rate, that's what you're going to get. If you read the book, again, they're all very well written, they're fascinating, they're creative, and as I say, they would give you a view of what the Archdiocese was like in the course of those 200 years. But at the end of each one of these articles is a subheading called Conclusion. We ask each one of these writers then, having finished his look into the past, to make a brief projection into the future. And in almost every case, in one way or another, suddenly it seems, but not really that suddenly when you look back on it, they all seem to feel that suddenly the wheels were coming off the car. Even as they were writing these pieces, it was happening around them. As they looked back and said, but what? But things are changing. Things have changed. Even as I look back, they're not the same. Since about, I'll grab a date, 1960, let's say. From then on, what? You had controversies about Vatican II, the divided pastors and parishes, the decline of priestly vocations was accompanied by the aging of priests and the virtual disappearance of nuns. Demographic changes, ethnic and cultural, during the same period were bringing new Catholics into the Archdiocese. Old churches were closed. Parochial schools were shut down. Old established parishes were either closed down or sharply reorganized. And then the disastrous explosion of the sexual abuse scandals, followed by something inconceivable, the resignation of a cardinal, left people's heads spinning. At a time, as most of these writers observe, the whole society in which they were writing about, the whole society seemed to have become more diverse, more secular, more irreligious. And these remarkable changes are reflected in each one of these essays, as the writers raise the question in their final paragraphs about the future of the particular subjects and institutions whose histories they have reviewed. What happened? What should be done? What are we going to do about these institutions, like parochial schools, for example, like Catholic charities, that have served us so well, but now are in serious danger? What will the future be like? Well, as I was thinking about this, I reread Jim O'Toole's recent book called The Faithful. I don't know if you've read it, but it's a really marvelous book about lay Catholics in the United States. And this popped into my mind. He said, historians are always more comfortable in the past than in the future. Or sometimes, he may have had me in mind, sometimes even in the present. They are thus unqualified, after recounting events that have brought them to their own time, to say much about what will be happening next. But the past is a guide, nevertheless, he says. The past is a guide, if only because it shows us the range of possibilities for the future. For American Catholic lay people, the Church of the 21st century will, in significant ways, recapitulate the historical experience of earlier ages. And so it's with that thinking in mind that we come to today's get-together about reflecting on the 4 topics that John McGinty mentioned that we might think about as we plan for the future, as we think for the future. One he called diversity. The question here would be, how do we respond to the transformation of the ethnic and the racial diversity in the Archdiocese of Boston? How can things like liturgical practices, the ecclesiastical structure, the whole social context of churches and parishes be changed or adjusted to meet these demographic changes which are already a part of the Archdiocesan society? A second topic is women in the church. And again, we have a question here in the light of new concepts, for example, and even newer concepts of feminism, and the increasing involvement of women in the social and the economic and the political life of the country. What changes or adjustments can be made, should be made, in what is still a patriarchal structure of the Catholic Church? Thirdly, parish life. I'm sure many of you are involved. Activities at the parish level now. And we have to ask, in view of the decline, continuing decline, in the number of priests and nuns, in view of the closing of churches and the reorganization of the traditional parish structure, what is the future of the parish? Will we have parishes anymore? Will new structures be developed? And within that, what are the responsibilities of laymen and laywomen? With the decrease in numbers of the religious. And finally, leadership. In terms of the problems facing the Catholic Church, as exemplified by diversity and women and parish life, In view of that, what new leadership roles can be undertaken by the hierarchy? What should be done at the leadership policy level in helping to adjust to a new era and to a new society? And so we come, I guess, some questions that John McGinty, as the head of church in the 21st century, and you yourself sitting there, might want to ask or answer. Who's going to do it? Who's going to do it? I mean, sit here and talk about, say, yeah, we know. But where can new ideas be generated? And again, my passing thought about the Catholic University being the place where the church does its thinking makes at least one area quite obvious. Where does Boston College come into the picture? What type of associations can be developed between C21, for example, in BC's student population? How can these issues that we've mentioned this morning, how can they become a part of the academic programs and the interests of a Catholic student body? And who's going to do it?